In April 2024, the FAA published the latest Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards, or ACS. This new document specifically states that electronic flight books can be used for flight planning and during the check ride. However, based on comments and questions from the hundreds of students and pilots I interact with, there's a lot of disagreement and confusion. In this video, we'll use a real-world example to answer the question of paper navigation log versus tablet planning once and for all. So several years ago, I was making a cross-country flight to visit family. To remain within weight and balance, I planned enough fuel to make it to our destination with 45 minutes of reserve. My route planning consisted of entering my departure and destination airports into ForeFlight and checking to make sure I wouldn't fly through any special use airspace or temporary flight restrictions. The weather forecast indicated that it would be a beautiful summer day. Using ForeFlight for time and fuel estimations, course planning, and reviewing the weather and NOTAMs took me about 10 minutes. Everything looked good, so we loaded up the airplane and we launched. For the first quarter of the trip, everything was going great. The GPS was clicking down the miles, and the displayed progress and ground speed were exactly as ForeFlight had predicted. As the trip progressed, it got a little bumpy, and my passengers asked if we could find smoother air. I climbed 2,000 feet to the next appropriate VFR altitude, and the turbulence went away, but our ground speed slowed down. Looking at ForeFlight and the GPS, it appeared we would arrive about 10 minutes later than planned, but we'd still have the required 30-minute fuel reserves with about 5 minutes to spare. This was concerning, but it was still good if things stayed the same. About 20 minutes later, I looked down at my iPad and GPS and noticed that I'd lost GPS signal on both. My phone wasn't helpful either. How the heck could that happen? I hadn't seen any related NOTAMs. I noticed the winds aloft forecast at our new altitude increased a little as the trip progressed, but it was a forecast. Would we be able to maintain our current ground speed? Would I need to make a stop? If so, where? The bottom line, I was now in a position where I would have to use pilotage and dead reckoning and would need to calculate my ground speed and decide what that meant for the trip. It was an almost perfect check ride scenario. After a brief moment of panic, I took a deep breath and I got to work. The first two things I did were check my heading indicator and visually verify my ground track. Then I picked a reference point along my ground track as far away from my aircraft as I could to use as a reference to stay on course. Next, I checked my planned route on the ForeFlight sectional to see if there were any ground-based landmarks that I could use to check position and progress. Fortunately, there were 2 river crossings and 4 towns coming up on either side of my planned path. I also noticed we would be passing close to a couple of airports that had fuel available in case we needed a stop. I quickly used the ruler in ForeFlight to determine the distance between each of these landmarks. Finally, I contacted ATC to report the situation and to let them know that my intention was to continue on to my destination. As I made the first river crossing, I verified I was close to my planned course and I started the timer on my phone. When I made the second river crossing, I rechecked my position against my course and noted the elapsed time. Then I used the distance and the time between the 2 crossings to calculate my ground speed. Luckily, the ground speed was actually several knots faster than what was in the ForeFlight Nav Log. Things were still going well. I continued the flight, doing the same verifications and calculations at each landmark. About 50 nautical miles later, my GPS signal returned. GPS location showed I was about 2 nautical miles right of course, but the GPS calculated ground speed was right on track with my hand calculations. I was able to quickly get back on course and finish the trip without further excitement. We ended up landing safely with slightly more than the required 30-minute fuel reserves. I was able to continue the trip because I'd practiced doing all of these things multiple times during my private pilot training. At the time, my CFI demanded that I become proficient in planning as well as pilotage and dead reckoning. Funny thing, the private pilot ACS and your DPE agree. So, whether you do your planning on paper or use an EFB application is not really the issue. These are just tools, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Using paper requires you to work through all the steps. It forces you to understand the math, the details, and where the numbers come from. Paper doesn't require batteries, and it can enable you to make changes anywhere, even in mid-flight. On the other hand, using paper takes significant practice, time, and effort. It's flat out more difficult, but it's a great learning tool. An EFB like ForeFlight can display maps, airport diagrams, airport information, and your nav log all in one place. This can significantly help with cockpit organization. These applications can also create performance estimates based on aircraft performance data, the current and forecast weather, and other information. As long as you've configured your EFB correctly, these estimates are highly accurate. In general, these tools can significantly shorten the planning and tracking process and make what-if scenarios much easier. However, if the EFB doesn't have access to information because there isn't GPS connectivity, or you forgot to download it, or you don't have internet connectivity, many of these benefits just disappear. So, the most important question is not whether you should use paper or your iPad. The question is whether or not you understand how to estimate and track your performance and how you're going to minimize the risk of anything getting between you and the safe completion of your flight. With that in mind, the best answer is that you need to be comfortable with both. If you're not, you could be putting yourself and your passengers at risk. By the way, you think GPS outages are a thing of the past? This morning, I researched the FAA NOTAM database and I found 21 NOTAMs in the continental United States for possible disruptions to GPS navigation services. Here's an example of one in Colorado. Would you be able to plan and fly a 339 nautical mile cross-country without a GPS, using either paper or your electronic flight bag? If not, you should watch my flight planning series starting with this video next. Did this information save you $1 worth of time or provide you $1 worth of clarity? If so, a tip would go a long way towards supporting future content. Please use the link in the description. As always, thank you for watching. Fly safely, and I will see you next time.